Homeless boy steers boat through storm. Heroically saves 70 lives. Jack Johnson gripped the fishing boat's wheel with desperate strength as towering waves rocked the vessel from side to side. The wind howled around him and rain lashed against his thin face, but he couldn't stop now. 70 people screamed in terror behind him, trapped on the deck of a ferry that was sinking rapidly just a few yards away. "Kid, you don't know what you're doing," shouted Ernest, the fisherman who owned the boat. "This storm will swallow us all." Jack completely ignored the older man's words. At 15, he had spent the last 3 years living in the port of Tampa, sleeping between shipping containers and surviving on scraps of food thrown away by workers. He knew those waters better than any adult in town. He had watched hundreds of boats sail through worse conditions than this. He knew exactly how to maneuver between the waves to avoid capsizing. The problem was, no one believed him. "You'll have to trust me," Jack said, jerking the wheel hard to the left as a 15-foot wave loomed ahead. "I'm these people's only chance." The tourist ferry had left that morning packed with passengers for a sightseeing trip around the local islands. No one expected a tropical storm to hit the coast so suddenly. Now, with its engine dead and hull cracking, the vessel was about to flip completely. The screams of the passengers cut through the air like knives, blending with the deafening roar of wind and waves. Jack had been the first to see the disaster unfolding. He was on the dock, searching for food, when he spotted the ferry rocking dangerously about 200 yards offshore. Without a second thought, he sprinted to Ernest's boat, tied up at the harbor, and started the engine. "Hey kid, get out of there!" Ernest had shouted, running after him. "People are dying out there," Jack yelled back, pointing at the ferry. "If you won't come with me, I'll go alone." Ernest looked where Jack was pointing and saw how dire the situation was. Reluctantly, he climbed aboard. But now he bitterly regretted letting a homeless teenager take control of his 40-year-old boat. The first obstacle appeared when they were just 50 yards from the struggling ferry. A wave even larger than the others rose like a green wall in front of them, completely blocking their view of their target. "Now we're really gonna flip," Ernest shouted, bracing himself. Jack took a deep breath and accelerated straight into the wave. It was a maneuver he'd seen experienced fishermen do dozens of times. Instead of trying to go around the wave, you had to power through it with speed and precision. The boat climbed the watery wall as if scaling a liquid mountain, reached the crest and plummeted down the other side with an impact that shook them from head to toe. But it worked. They had cleared the first barrier. How did you know?" Ernest gasped, still catching his breath. "Learned by watching," Jack replied simply, already focusing on the next challenge. The ferry was now directly ahead, tilted at a dangerous angle. Jack could clearly see the people huddled on the higher side, trying to stay away from the water flooding the lower deck. There were adults clutching children, elderly passengers leaning on each other, all with expressions of sheer panic. But when Jack tried to get closer, he realized it wouldn't be so easy. The storm had created a powerful current around the ferry, a kind of whirlpool sucking everything toward the jagged rocks east of the island. "If we get caught in that current, we'll smash into the rocks," Ernest warned. Jack studied the movement of the water for a few seconds, calculating angles and speeds in his mind. There was a way to reach the ferry, but it required surgical precision and perfect timing. "Hold on tight," he said, turning the steering wheel hard to the right. Instead of going straight, Jack began making a wide turn, using the force of the current to his advantage. It was like surfing, but with a 6-meter fishing boat. The boat gained speed as it was pushed by the water, and at just the right moment, Jack cut across the current, escaping it with only a few meters to spare. They were now alongside the ferry. "My God, you came to save us," shouted a gray-haired woman standing at the edge of the endangered vessel. "Easy now, Dorothy," Jack replied, recognizing the merchant who ran a pastry stall at the harbor. "We'll get everyone off safely." Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, don't forget to hit the like button and especially subscribe to the channel. It really helps us newcomers out. Now, back to the story. The second obstacle arose when Jack realized it would be impossible to transfer 70 people from one vessel to another in the middle of such a massive storm. The waves slammed the two boats violently against each other, creating a huge risk of someone falling overboard or being crushed between them. "What now?" asked Ernest, also sensing the difficulty. Jack looked around, searching for a solution. The storm showed no signs of letting up. If anything, the lightning was growing more frequent and the wind stronger. He needed a different plan. That's when he spotted the small island about 400 meters away. It was uninhabited, but had a sheltered beach where the ferry could safely run aground, if they could make it there. "I'll tow you to the island," Jack shouted to the people on the ferry. "With what rope, kid?" snapped a scowling man Jack didn't recognize. "We don't have any cable strong enough for that." Jack scanned Ernest's boat and found 3 pieces of fishing rope, each about 20 meters long. Not ideal, but it would have to do. "Ernest, help me tie these ropes together," he called. Working quickly, the two connected the ropes, creating a 60-meter line. Ernest offered to be the one to jump onto the ferry to secure it, but Jack refused. "You need to stay at the engine," he said. "I'll do it." Before Ernest could protest, Jack had already leaped onto the dangerously swaying ferry. The impact nearly knocked him off balance, but he managed to grab onto a metal railing and steady himself. The people on the ferry watched him with a mix of hope and desperation. There were whole families there, people of all ages who had set out for a fun trip and now faced a life-or-death situation. "Anyone hurt?" Jack asked as he searched for the best place to tie the rope. "Some bruises, but nothing serious," replied a man in his 60s who seemed to be the group's informal leader. "Do you really think you can get us out of here?" "I'll try," Jack said, finally spotting a solid metal structure where he could fasten the knot. "But you'll all need to gather at the back of the ferry. If everyone stays at the front, the weight will snap the rope." The people moved as Jack instructed, but then he noticed a third obstacle. Among the 70 passengers was Richard Parker, the local marina manager who always treated him like dirt. Richard was a man in his early 40s, always well-dressed and arrogant. He never missed a chance to humiliate Jack in front of others, calling him punk and good for nothing. Now, however, he was in the same desperate situation as everyone else. "Are you all going to trust your lives to this street kid?" Richard said loudly. "He can barely even read." Some people began to murmur, clearly influenced by Richard's words. Jack felt his stomach tighten. He knew his appearance didn't inspire confidence. Dirty clothes, messy hair, a thin face from often going hungry. But he also knew he was those people's only hope. "Listen," Jack said, raising his voice so everyone could hear. "I've lived in this harbor for 3 years. I know these waters better than any of you. If you want to reach the island alive, you'll have to trust me." "And why should we?" Richard insisted. "You're just some street kid." It was Dorothy, the pastry vendor, who defended him. "Richard, shut your mouth. This boy risked his own life to come help us when no one else showed up." Jack wasted no more time arguing. He finished tying the rope and signaled to Ernest that he was ready. The fishing boat began to move slowly, testing the strength of the makeshift cable. The first attempt nearly ended in disaster. The rope held, but the raft started tipping sideways from the uneven towing force. Jack quickly noticed the problem and shouted instructions for Ernest to adjust the angle. "Left! More to the left!" he yelled, gesturing frantically. After a few tense adjustments, they found their rhythm. The raft was being towed, but far too slowly. The island was still a long way off, and Jack estimated it would take at least 20 minutes to get there at this pace. The problem was, the raft didn't have 20 minutes. The crack in the hull was widening, and more water rushed in with every wave. Jack could feel the vessel sinking lower in the water. "Ernest!" he shouted. "We need to go faster." "If I speed up too much, the rope will snap," Ernest shouted back. Jack looked around, desperately searching for a solution. That's when he noticed some people were using small buckets and kitchen utensils from the boat to bail water off the deck. It was a good idea, but not enough. "Everyone who can, start bailing water," Jack ordered. "Use whatever you can find." Pots, cups, even shoes were turned into makeshift buckets. It was a constant battle against time and nature. With every passing minute, more water poured in, but the people worked together to remove it almost as fast. Richard, however, refused to help. "I won't stoop to this," he said, crossing his arms. "I paid for a ride, not to work." His selfish attitude was starting to affect the group's morale. Some people stopped working and began complaining too. Jack realized he was losing control of the situation. Then came the fourth obstacle. One of the storm's lightning bolts struck the water less than 100 yards from Ernest's boat, creating a blinding flash and a deafening roar. The shock made Ernest lose control of the wheel for a few seconds, and the fishing boat veered off course, stretching the tow rope to near breaking. "Watch out!" Jack shouted, but it was too late. The sudden change in direction sent the raft spinning violently, throwing several people to the side. An elderly woman slipped and hit her head on a metal railing, opening a nasty gash on her forehead. "Margaret!" Dorothy cried, rushing to help her friend. Jack leaped to where the injured woman lay. She was conscious, but bleeding heavily. He pulled off his own shirt and made an improvised bandage, pressing the fabric against the wound to stop the bleeding. "It's going to be okay, Margaret," he said softly. "We'll be on solid ground soon." The situation was deteriorating rapidly. Besides the injured woman, other people were starting to panic. Some were crying, others were screaming, and all of them looked at Jack as if he were responsible for miraculously saving them. The weight of responsibility was overwhelming. Jack was only 15 years old and trying to save 70 lives under impossible conditions. For a moment, he doubted himself. Maybe Richard was right. Maybe he was just a street kid who didn't know what he was doing. But then he remembered why he was there. 3 years ago, he had lost his parents in a boat accident just like this one. Back then, no one had come to save them. He had sworn he would never let others go through what he had. "Listen up, everyone," he shouted, standing in the middle of the raft. "I know you're scared, I am too, but giving up is not an option. We're getting to that island together, or we're not getting there at all." His words seemed to have some effect. People stopped arguing and went back to bailing water from the deck. Even Richard reluctantly began to help. Ernest managed to stabilize the fishing boat again, and the towing continued. The island was getting closer, but there were still at least 200 meters to go. That's when the fifth obstacle appeared. The rope was starting to fray. Jack noticed it first. The cable was splitting strand by strand, fiber by fiber, under the extreme pressure. He estimated they had 5 minutes at most before the rope snapped completely. "Ernest!" he yelled. "The rope's breaking!" "What do we do?" Ernest shouted back. Jack looked around frantically. They were about 150 meters from the island's shore, too far to swim safely, especially with children and elderly in the group. But maybe there was another way. "Do you have life jackets?" he asked the group. "Some," Dorothy replied. "Not enough for everyone." Jack quickly counted. There were about 30 life jackets on the raft. Not enough for 70 people, but maybe enough for the most vulnerable. "Put the jackets on the children and the elderly," he ordered. "If the rope breaks, at least they'll float." People started distributing the jackets, but Richard protested. "What about us? We'll be left with nothing." "Can you swim?" Jack asked. "Yes, but then you go without a jacket. Kids come first." Richard turned red with anger, but said nothing more. Jack kept organizing people, grouping them based on their swimming abilities and placing the strongest near the weakest so they could help if needed. The rope kept unraveling. Jack could hear the sound of fibers snapping one by one, like little cracks in the middle of the storm's noise. 100 meters, 90 meters, 80 meters. "It's going to break," someone shouted. 70 meters, 60 meters. Jack made a desperate decision. He grabbed a smaller rope from the raft and tied it around his waist. Then he positioned himself at the edge of the boat, ready to jump. "What are you doing?" Dorothy asked. "If the main rope breaks, I'll swim to shore and pull you with this smaller rope," Jack explained. "That's insane," Richard said. "You'll drown." "Maybe," Jack admitted, "but it's our only chance." 50 meters, 40 meters, 30 meters. The main rope finally snapped. The raft immediately started drifting away from the island, pushed by the wind and waves. Jack didn't hesitate. He jumped into the freezing water and began swimming desperately toward the shore, pulling the smaller rope behind him. The water was colder than ice, and the waves dragged him under every few meters. Jack fought to keep his head above water as he swam with all his strength. The rope was heavy and pulled him backward, but he kept going. 20 meters, 15 meters, 10 meters. Jack finally felt the sandy bottom of the beach beneath his feet. He was exhausted and nearly out of breath, but he didn't stop. He ran out of the water, tied the rope to a large tree on the shore, and began pulling the raft. Alone, he didn't have enough strength to move a vessel carrying 70 people, but his actions inspired the others. The people on the raft started paddling with their hands, pushing objects in the water to create momentum, doing anything they could to help the boat move toward the shore. Ernest also helped, pushing the raft from behind with his fishing boat. Little by little, meter by meter, the raft drew closer to the beach. When it finally ran aground on the sand, the 70 people wept with relief. Jack fell to his knees on the shore, completely spent. He had done it. All 70 people were safe, but the story wasn't over. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, take a moment to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It helps us a lot as we're just starting out. Now, continuing. As the people celebrated on the beach, Jack noticed Richard had disappeared. He looked around and saw him walking alone toward the rocky part of the island, away from the group. Something wasn't right. Jack followed Richard discreetly, keeping his distance to avoid being seen. The man was talking on his cell phone, which somehow still worked despite getting wet. "Yes, everyone's alive," Richard was saying. "No, it didn't go as planned. The kid managed to save them." A chill ran down Jack's spine. What was Richard talking about? "I don't know how he knew so much about navigation," Richard continued, "but now we have a bigger problem. He's become a hero. Everyone's talking about him. Yes, I understand. We'll have to stop the story from spreading." Jack couldn't believe what he was hearing. Richard seemed involved in some kind of conspiracy related to the raft accident, but it made no sense. Why would anyone want people to get hurt? He tried to move closer to hear better, but stepped on a dry twig that snapped. Richard turned immediately and saw him. "Hey, you!" Richard shouted, quickly putting away his phone. "What are you doing here?" I just wanted to see if you were okay," Jack lied, trying to sound innocent. Richard eyed him suspiciously but said nothing more. He walked back to where the group had gathered, and Jack followed, pretending nothing had happened. But now, he had a new worry. Something very strange was going on, and Richard was at the center of it. The people were setting up a makeshift camp on the beach. The storm was beginning to ease, but it still wasn't safe to go back out to sea. They'd have to spend the night on the island and hope someone would come to rescue them in the morning. Dorothy approached Jack with gratitude in her eyes. "My boy," she said, gently touching his face, "you saved all our lives today. How can we ever thank you?" "No need to thank me," Jack replied, still unsettled by what he'd heard Richard say on the phone. "I just did what anyone would do." "No, you didn't," said Margaret, who had a bandage on her head but was feeling better. "Most people would have run. You stayed and fought for us." Jack smiled shyly. Praise made him uncomfortable. For years, most people in town had treated him like a nuisance. Now, suddenly, he was seen as a hero, but Richard's conversation still nagged at him. He decided he needed to find out more about what was going on. When night fell and most of the people were asleep around a campfire they'd made with dry branches, Jack crept over to where Richard was lying. The man seemed to be asleep, but Jack heard the faint sound of a phone conversation. He hid behind a large rock and tried to listen. "The ferry wasn't supposed to get close to the shore," Richard whispered into the phone. "You said the engine would completely stop once it reached the danger zone. What do you mean, botched sabotage?" Jack felt his heart race. Richard was clearly involved in something criminal. The ferry had been sabotaged on purpose. "Listen," Richard continued, "if this gets out, we'll all be in trouble, especially after that kid became the town's hero. Yes, I know where he lives, or rather, where he usually sleeps." The implied threat made Jack feel fear for the first time since the adventure had begun. Richard wasn't just involved in the ferry sabotage, he was planning something against Jack too. But why? What was the motive for sabotaging a tourist ferry? Jack returned to his spot near the campfire but couldn't sleep. He kept thinking about what he'd discovered, trying to understand the motives behind the conspiracy. The next morning, a Coast Guard boat arrived to rescue the group. The people were taken back to the port of Tampa, where a crowd of reporters and onlookers waited to hear the story of the heroic rescue. "It was all thanks to Jack," said Dorothy to the reporters. "He saved us all." "How did you learn to navigate so well?" a reporter asked Jack. "By watching," he replied shyly. "I've lived at the port for a few years." The story spread quickly. Within hours, Jack was being called the hero of the port by the local papers. People who had never cared about him before now wanted to talk and take photos. But Jack didn't feel like a hero. He was worried about Richard and what the man might be planning. That night, Jack slept in his usual spot, a space between two containers at the port, where he'd made a sort of shelter with tarps and cardboard. It was uncomfortable and cold, but it was the only place he called home. Around 2 in the morning, he was woken by hushed voices. Peering through a gap in the tarp, he saw 3 men approaching his shelter. One of them was Richard. "This is where the brat sleeps," Richard said to the other 2. "Let's teach him a lesson, so he learns not to stick his nose where it doesn't belong." Panic surged through Jack. He knew he couldn't escape unseen, and the 3 men were much bigger and stronger than him. But then he had an idea. Quietly, he grabbed his broken cell phone, which he'd found in the trash months earlier. The phone didn't work, but it still had a small red light that blinked when a button was pressed. As the men neared the shelter, Jack held up the phone so the red light was visible and shouted, "I've already called the police. They're recording everything." The men froze. Richard glanced around nervously. "Let's get out of here," one of the thugs said. "If the cops show up, we're in trouble." "No, wait," Richard insisted. "He's just a lying kid." But Jack was already running. He leaped over the containers with the agility of someone who knew every inch of the place and vanished into the darkness of the port. He spent the rest of the night hiding inside an abandoned container, thinking about what to do. Now he was certain Richard and his thugs were involved in something very serious, and that he himself was in danger. The next morning, he decided to look for Ernest. The older fisherman might know something about the ferry sabotage. He found Ernest cleaning his boat at the dock. The man smiled when he saw him approaching. "Jack, how's our hero doing?" Ernest said. "Everyone in town is talking about you." "Ernest, I need to talk to you about something important," said Jack, looking around to make sure they weren't being watched. "Of course, my boy. What is it?" Jack told Ernest everything he'd heard Richard say on the phone. Ernest grew very serious as the story unfolded. "This is very serious," Ernest said when Jack finished. "If what you're saying is true, Richard is involved in something criminal." "Do you know why he'd do this?" Jack asked. Ernest thought for a moment before answering. "Richard has worked at the marina for many years," he finally said. "He's always been ambitious, always wanted to make more money. Last year, rumors started that he was involved in shady business." "What kind of business?" "Insurance," Ernest said. "They say he convinces boat owners to take out expensive policies, then arranges accidents so they can collect the payout." That made sense. If Richard was involved in insurance fraud, he'd have a reason to sabotage the tourist ferry. He'd probably made a deal with the boat owner to split the insurance money. "But something went wrong," Jack said, understanding the situation. "The ferry wasn't supposed to make it close to shore. It should have sunk far from any help. And now that you saved everyone, there's no way they can collect the insurance money," Ernest finished. "That's why Richard is angry with you." "What do I do?" Jack asked. "Last night they tried to intimidate me, and I'm sure they'll try again." Ernest placed a fatherly hand on Jack's shoulder. "First, you're staying off the streets," he said. "You can stay at my place while we sort this out. Second, we're going to the police to report Richard." Jack felt a wave of gratitude. Ernest was offering real help, not just empty praise. "You'd do that for me?" he asked. "Of course," Ernest replied. "You saved 70 lives yesterday. It's the least I can do." But when they arrived at the police station, they found Richard had gotten there first. "Ah, you must be here about the accusations against the boy," the officer said when they introduced themselves. "What accusations?" Jack asked, confused. "Richard Parker was here an hour ago," the officer explained. "He said you trespassed on a private boat and endangered 70 lives with your reckless maneuvers." Jack felt the world spin around him. Richard had completely flipped the situation, turning him from a hero into a criminal. "But that's not true," Ernest protested. "Jack saved those people." "It's Mr. Parker's word against yours," the officer said. And Mr. Parker is a respected member of the maritime community. Jack realized he was in an impossible spot. Richard had resources, influence, and credibility. He was just a street kid whose word meant nothing against a well-established adult's. Besides, the officer continued, there's evidence the boy may have sabotaged the ferry himself to create a situation where he could play the hero. That's ridiculous, Ernest exploded. Maybe, the officer said, but until we investigate further, the boy can't go near the marina or any boats in the harbor. They left the station defeated. Richard had not only dodged suspicion, but effectively banned Jack from the only place he called home. What do we do now? Jack asked, feeling lost. We prove your innocence, Ernest said firmly. But it won't be easy. They went to Ernest's house, a small two-bedroom place near the harbor. It was the first time in 3 years Jack slept in a real bed. But the physical comfort didn't ease his mental anguish. Jack knew Richard wasn't going to stop there. The man had a lot to lose if the truth about the sabotage came out. Over the next few days, Jack and Ernest tried to gather evidence against Richard. They spoke to other fishermen, investigated rumors about insurance fraud, and even tried to find out who the thugs were that had threatened Jack. But at every step, they faced obstacles. People were afraid to speak out against Richard. The insurance records were confidential, and the thugs seemed to have vanished completely. To make matters worse, Richard was spreading his version of the story all over town. According to him, Jack was a troublemaker who had created a dangerous situation and then exploited it for fame. People are starting to believe him, Ernest said sadly, after returning from a fruitless conversation with other fishermen. Richard has way more influence than we do. Jack felt frustrated and powerless. He had risked his life to save 70 people, and now he was being treated like a criminal. The injustice of it all ate away at him. That's when Dorothy showed up at Ernest's door. Jack, she said, giving him a tight hug, I'm so glad I found you. I've been looking everywhere. Dorothy, Jack said, surprised. How did you know I was here? I asked half the port until someone told me, she replied. I need to talk to you about something important. Dorothy stepped inside and sat at the kitchen table with a serious expression. I've heard the rumors Richard is spreading about you, she said. And I also heard about the accusations at the police station. He's lying, Dorothy, Jack said. I would never do anything to hurt those people. I know, Dorothy said firmly, and that's why I'm here. I have something that might help you. She pulled a cell phone from her bag. During the storm when we were on the ferry, I recorded some videos, she explained. At the time I was so scared I wasn't even thinking straight. But last night, I decided to check the recordings. Dorothy showed the phone to Jack and Ernest. On the small screen they could clearly see the scene on the ferry during the storm. The video showed Jack organizing the rescue, helping people, risking his own life to save others. This proves you're innocent, Ernest said excitedly. It's not just that, Dorothy said. Look at this part. She fast-forwarded to a section where Richard was talking to someone on the phone during the storm. The audio wasn't very clear because of the wind and waves, but a few words were audible. It wasn't supposed to... Plan failed, Richard was saying in the video. We'll need to enhance the audio, Ernest said, but this is already evidence. For the first time in days, Jack felt a surge of hope. Finally, they had something concrete against Richard. Dorothy, you're an angel, he said, hugging her again. You saved my life, dear, she replied. It's the least I can do. But when they tried to take the video to the police station, they hit another roadblock. The sheriff refused to look at the recordings. Videos can easily be manipulated, he said. Besides, I can't base an investigation on amateur footage taken during a high-stress situation. But this proves Jack was trying to help, Dorothy protested. Or it proves he's good at acting, the sheriff countered. I'm sorry, but I need more solid evidence. They left the station even more frustrated than before. It was clear the sheriff didn't want to investigate Richard, likely because of the man's influence in town. What now? Jack asked. Now we try a different approach, Ernest said with determination. If we can't get official justice, we'll go for public justice. How so? Let's show this video to everyone who was on the ferry, explained Ernest. If they see the truth, Richard won't be able to keep up his lie. It was a good idea, but carrying it out would be complicated. Richard had asked people not to speak to Jack, claiming he might try to intimidate them into changing their stories. Mrs. Dorothy volunteered to be the intermediary. She began visiting the others who had been on the ferry, showing them the video and explaining the real situation. Gradually, the true version of events started to spread. One by one, the people Jack had saved began telling the real story to their friends and family. Richard realized he was losing control of the narrative and grew desperate. He started spreading even more absurd rumors about Jack, claiming he was part of a gang of teenage pirates who attacked tourist boats. But the accusations became so exaggerated that they lost credibility. People began questioning Richard's motives for attacking a boy who had saved lives so fiercely. Then came the event that would change everything. Mrs. Margaret, the elderly woman who had been injured during the rescue, decided to organize a meeting with all 70 people from the ferry. She rented a local church hall and invited the whole community to hear first-hand accounts. "The time for truth has come," Mrs. Margaret said as she opened the meeting. "Let's tell exactly what happened that day. No fear, no lies." One by one, the people from the ferry shared their versions of the story. All confirmed the same thing. Jack had risked his life to save them, and Richard had been the only one criticizing and hindering the rescue efforts. When it was Richard's turn to speak, he tried to stick to his false version, but was interrupted by Mrs. Dorothy, who showed the video to the entire audience. "See for yourselves," she said, connecting her phone to a projector. "This is the real footage of what happened." The video played on the hall's wall, clearly showing Jack organizing the rescue, while Richard acted selfishly and destructively. When it reached the part where Richard spoke on the phone about the failed plan, murmurs of outrage spread through the crowd. "Explain this, Richard," Mrs. Margaret said, pointing at the screen. Richard tried to claim the audio was distorted, that people were misinterpreting his words, but it was too late. The evidence was too clear to deny. "You're making a mistake," Richard said, visibly nervous. "You're trusting a street kid's word over mine." "No," a firm voice spoke from the crowd. "We're trusting our own eyes and ears." It was the man who had introduced himself as the group's informal leader on the ferry. He stood and addressed Richard directly. "I watched you the whole time during the storm," he said. "I saw how you refused to help, how you criticized the boy trying to save us, and now I'm hearing your suspicious phone call." Others began speaking up too, recalling strange behavior from Richard they had noticed, but hadn't fully understood at the time. "You knew the ferry was going to have trouble, didn't you?" Mrs. Dorothy asked bluntly. Richard tried to deny it, but his body language gave him away, sweating, avoiding eye contact, shifting restlessly. "This is ridiculous," he said, his voice shaky. "You're making up conspiracies." Then Mrs. Margaret asked the question no one had thought of before. "Richard, were you scheduled to be on that ferry?" Silence fell over the hall. "What do you mean?" Richard asked, visibly uncomfortable. "Did you buy your ticket in advance, or was it a last-minute decision?" Richard hesitated too long before answering. "It was last minute. I decided to go at the last second." "Strange," said Mrs. Margaret. "Because I worked at the tourist excursion ticket booth for 10 years before retiring. I know Richard Parker has had a standing reservation on the first ferry every Saturday for at least 2 years. Now Richard was clearly panicking. He'd been caught in another lie. "If you always take that ferry," Mrs. Margaret continued, "why was this time different? Why did you know something would go wrong?" The pressure was too much. Richard finally broke. "Fine," he shouted. "Yes, I knew there'd be problems, but no one was supposed to get hurt. It was just supposed to break down and need towing back." The room erupted in murmurs of outrage. Richard had just publicly confessed his involvement in the sabotage. "It was a simple plan," Richard went on, now speaking quickly as if he wanted to get it all out at once. "The ferry owner was broke, needed the insurance money. I arranged for the engine to fail when we were far from shore but close enough to be towed safely." "And what did you get out of it?" someone in the crowd asked. "A cut," Richard admitted. "The owner was going to split the insurance money with me." "But something went wrong," said Jack, speaking for the first time during the meeting. "The idiot who sabotaged the engine messed up," Richard said angrily. "Instead of just braking, the engine cracked the hull, and then came the storm that wasn't forecasted." "So you knew we were all in real danger," said Mrs. Dorothy, horrified. "I couldn't do anything," Richard defended himself. If I told the truth, everyone would find out I was involved. So you'd rather let 70 people die to protect your secret, Mrs. Margaret said with disgust. Richard tried to justify himself, but there was no possible justification. He'd risked 70 lives for money, and then tried to ruin the reputation of the boy who saved everyone. The police were called, and Richard was arrested on the spot. His public confession had been heard by over 200 people, including several who recorded everything on their phones. But the story wasn't over yet. In the days following Richard's arrest, more details of the scheme came to light. The police investigation found he was involved in an insurance fraud ring that had been operating for at least 3 years, staging accidents with fishing boats and tourist vessels. The ferry owner was also arrested, along with others involved in the scheme. The investigation revealed they'd caused at least 12 previous accidents, always making sure no one was seriously hurt. But this time, something had gone terribly wrong, and only Jack's courage had prevented a real tragedy. Jack was completely cleared of all charges. The detective who had refused to investigate the case was transferred to another town after an internal investigation revealed he'd been bribed by Richard to ignore evidence. Jack's story spread far beyond the borders of Tampa. Newspapers across Florida reported the story of the street kid who saved 70 lives and then exposed a criminal ring. Offers of help began pouring in from everywhere. Families offered to adopt Jack. Business owners offered jobs, schools offered scholarships. But Jack had already made up his mind about his future. "I want to stay with Ernest," he said, when a social worker came to discuss placement options. "He took me in when no one else cared about me." Ernest was moved to tears by Jack's choice. The adoption process began immediately, with Mrs. Dorothy and Mrs. Margaret serving as character witnesses. Jack also decided he wanted to use his experience to help others. With Ernest's help and the women he had rescued, he started organizing free navigation and water safety classes for underprivileged youth in the area. "I want to teach other boys like me not to be afraid of the water," Jack explained to a reporter. "The ocean can be dangerous, but it can also be a source of life and opportunity." The classes were held on Saturdays at the same harbor where Jack had once lived on the streets. Ironically, the space was provided by the marina's new management, which wanted to improve its image after Richard's scandal. Mrs. Dorothy and Mrs. Margaret became volunteers for the project, helping with administrative tasks and offering emotional support to the young participants. "These boys remind me of Jack," Mrs. Dorothy often said. "They just need a chance to show what they're capable of." The project grew quickly. Within a few months, Jack was teaching navigation to over 30 underprivileged youth in the area. Some were orphans, others came from very poor families, but they all found in the ocean a new way to see the future. Ernest helped with the practical lessons, teaching the technical aspects of navigation and boat maintenance. His 40 years of experience as a fisherman were invaluable to the young students. "Jack has a natural gift for teaching," Ernest said proudly. "He connects with these boys in a way I never could." It was true. Jack understood the fears, frustrations, and dreams of these underprivileged youth because he had been in the same situation. He knew what it felt like to be invisible, ignored by society, judged by appearance rather than actions. "The ocean doesn't care if you're rich or poor," Jack told his students. "It only cares if you respect it and are willing to learn." A year after the rescue, Jack received a special invitation. The city of Tampa wanted to honor him with a merit medal, officially recognizing his heroic act. The ceremony was held in the City Hall's Grand Chamber, attended by local officials, Coast Guard representatives, and many of the people Jack had saved during the storm. Mrs. Dorothy and Mrs. Margaret sat in the front row, dressed in their finest clothes and beaming with pride. Ernest stood beside Jack on stage, also being honored for his role in the rescue. "Jack Johnson," the mayor said during his speech, "represents the best of human nature. He proved that courage and compassion don't depend on age, money, or social status, but on character." When Jack stepped up to the microphone to accept the honor, he gave a simple but moving speech. "I didn't do anything special," he said. "I just did what anyone should do when they see others in danger. I hope my story inspires people to help when they have the chance." After the ceremony, there was a reception where Jack got to speak with many of the people he had saved. It was touching to see how their lives had been changed by the experience. Some had switched careers, inspired by Jack's courage. Others had started volunteering, wanting to give back to the community. They all carried the memory of that day as a moment that shifted their outlook on life. "Tao taught us that heroes really do exist," said one of the women from the ferry, "and sometimes they come in the most unexpected packages." Richard, meanwhile, had been sentenced to 8 years in prison for fraud and endangering lives. The scheme he had orchestrated caused millions in losses for insurance companies, not to mention the psychological trauma for the victims of his staged accidents. During the trial, Richard tried to downplay his guilt, claiming he never intended to seriously hurt anyone. But the evidence showed he knew the accidents were becoming increasingly dangerous, and it was only a matter of time before someone got seriously injured, or worse. The defendant showed complete disregard for human life, the judge said during sentencing. His actions could have resulted in a tragedy of immense proportions, if not for the extraordinary courage of one young man. Jack didn't attend the trial. He said he'd rather focus on the future than relive the past, but he heard about the sentence and felt relieved that Richard could no longer harm others. 2 years after the rescue, Jack's sailing project had expanded significantly. It now operated in 3 different ports along the Florida coast, serving over 100 underprivileged youth. Jack, now 17, had become something of a local celebrity. He was often invited to speak at schools about courage, determination, and helping others. "What matters isn't where you come from," Jack would say in his talks, "but where you're going. We all have the power to choose what kind of person we want to be." His speeches always ended with the same message: if you see someone in danger, don't wait for someone else to help. Be the person who makes a difference. Ernest had retired from fishing to dedicate himself fully to the project. At 62, he said teaching kids to sail was the most rewarding work he'd ever done. "Jack gave me a new purpose in life," Ernest would say. "At my age, I thought I'd already made my contribution to the world, but he showed me it's never too late to make a difference." The house they shared had become a gathering place for the kids in the program. It was common to see groups of students there on weekends, planning practice trips, or just talking about their dreams and aspirations. Dorothy had become a sort of adoptive mother to many of the kids. Her pastry stand at the dock now offered free meals to students in the program, funded by donations that kept coming in from people inspired by Jack's story. "These boys give me energy," Dorothy would say. "Seeing the spark in their eyes when they learn something new reminds me why life is worth fighting for." Margaret, despite her advanced age, remained active in the project. At 73, she was in charge of the training center's library, where the kids could study naval theory and maritime history. "Knowledge is power," she often said. "The more these boys know about the sea, the safer and more confident they'll be." The 3rd anniversary of the rescue was marked by a special ceremony. A commemorative plaque was installed at the dock where Jack had set out to save the 70 lives, preserving the event for future generations. The plaque read simply, "In memory of the heroic act of Jack Johnson, who proved that courage has no age and that a generous heart can move mountains." During the ceremony, Jack gave another speech, this time reflecting on everything that had happened since that stormy day. "3 years ago, I was just a boy living on the streets," he said. "Today, I have a family, a purpose, and the chance to help other kids find their own paths. None of this would have been possible without the people who believed in me when I needed it most." He looked at Ernest, Dorothy, Margaret, and all the others who had become his extended family. "I've learned that heroism isn't about doing something extraordinary once," he continued. "It's about making the right choices every day, even when it's hard. It's about caring for others and being willing to act when they need help." The audience was visibly moved. Many openly wept, touched by the wisdom and maturity Jack had developed despite his youth. One of the young students in the program, a 14-year-old boy named Tyler, who had lost his parents in an accident, asked to speak as well. "Jack taught me that no matter how tough your situation is," said Tyler, his voice trembling with emotion, "there's always hope if you're willing to work for it. He saved me, just like he saved those people in the storm. Only he saved me in a different way." Other students began sharing their own stories of how the program had changed their lives. Some had earned scholarships to universities. Others had found jobs in the maritime industry. Everyone spoke of how Jack had given them hope and direction. "He taught us that where we come from doesn't define our future," said a 15-year-old girl who had joined the program after running away from home due to family troubles. "We can choose who we want to be." As the testimonials continued, it became clear that Jack's impact had stretched far beyond the original rescue. He had created a legacy of hope and transformation that would influence lives for decades. When the ceremony ended, Jack walked to the edge of the dock and gazed at the sea. The water was calm that day, reflecting the afternoon sun like a golden mirror. It was hard to believe that same sea had been the stage for so much terror and drama 3 years earlier. Ernest joined him in silent contemplation. "What's on your mind?" the older man asked. "How much everything has changed," Jack replied. "That day in the storm, I was just trying to save those people. I never imagined it would change my whole life. Sometimes the most important moments of our lives happen when we least expect them," Ernest said wisely. "What matters is being ready to make the right choices when those moments come." Jack nodded thoughtfully. There was deep truth in those words. His life had completely changed because of a decision he'd made in seconds, without stopping to consider the consequences. "Do you regret anything?" Ernest asked. Jack took a moment before answering. "I regret that Richard managed to deceive so many people for so long," he said finally. "I regret that others suffered because of his schemes before I uncovered them, but I don't regret jumping into that boat that day." "Nor should you," Ernest said. "You did what was right even when it was dangerous. That's the definition of courage." They stood in silence for a few more minutes, watching seagulls glide over the water and listening to the gentle sound of waves against the dock. "Ernest," Jack said eventually, "thank you for everything. For giving me a chance when no one else would. For believing in me. For becoming the family I never thought I'd have." Ernest smiled and draped an arm over Jack's shoulders in a fatherly gesture. "No need to thank me," he said. "You've given me far more than I've given you. You gave me purpose, a reason to get up every day. You made me proud of who I am and what I can offer the world." As the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, Jack felt at peace. He had weathered both literal and metaphorical storms and emerged stronger from each one. The future was still uncertain, but he was no longer afraid. He had learned that with courage, determination, and the right people by his side, any obstacle could be overcome. And there were 70 living souls to prove it. End of the story. Dear listeners, what an incredible story we just followed. Jack showed us that true courage comes from the heart, not from age or social status. What did you think of his transformation and the project he created? Share your thoughts about this exciting journey in the comments. Don't forget to leave your like and subscribe to the channel for more soul-touching stories.